introduce our first presentation this morning. We have Colleen presenting Radicalized Visions of the Other, Histories of Orientalism Behind La Bayadère. Colleen recently completed her MFA from the University of Utah. And she seeks to encourage ballet's much-needed shift to inclusivity through her research and teaching. Colleen has worked for the Joffrey Ballet School in varying teaching and administrative roles since 2009, with which she has taught across the United States and abroad. She is the artistic director of Joffrey South, Joffrey Colorado Springs, and Joffrey Heartland Summer Intensives. Colleen danced professionally with the Dayton Ballet, Ballet Pensacola, and Dance Now, Miami. Colleen.
Hi friends, thanks for being here, I so appreciate it. So this paper is my response to the conversations that are occurring in this ballet community presently concerning equity, diversity, cultural appropriation, inclusion. And it is my hope that this paper will not only further encourage this conversation that's already happening, but that we can take it to a more critical level so that we can truly begin to push the art forward. So my research modalities are: 1, the history of the production La Bayadère from the 19th century to the present. Number 2, India's colonial history and relationships with Western powers. And number 3, a lens of post-colonial theory. And as these approaches intersected in my research, parallels began to emerge between colonial milestones in relationship to misrepresentation on stage. So, meshing colonial and ballet histories, starting with the ballet we all know, La Bayadère, premiered in 1877, choreographed by Marius Padukov for Russia. And this premiere date is significant because it follows just decades after Russia and France fought over India as a symbol for colonial power. It also predates the British-led anti-Nazi campaign and coincides with Russia's slow rise to a Western status. But go back a few years, there's an opera ballet, Le Deux et la Bayadère, choreographed by Filippo Taglioni, which premiered in 1830. Now, this premiere date is significant because it's just 2 years after the British began their aggressive reform of Indian culture. Go back 20 more years, though, to the opera, choreographed by longtime artistic director of the Paris Opera, Pierre Gardel, which premiered in 1810 at the Paris Opera. And this premiere date is significant because it is a decade after Napoleon's withdrawal from India. France had a soft power over India from 1798 to 1801. It's also 6 years into Napoleon's reign of France, in which he controlled the performance art across Paris as a form of propaganda. As the British took on a greater presence in India, France maintained its soft power in the country in the form of 5 trading posts, but the colonial aspirations for control never ceased. So I want to take a second for those of you who may be less familiar with Orientalism as a term. Edward Said, in his book, Orientalism, on page 1, defines Orientalism as, quote, a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. These 2 photos are of the Bolshoi production, post-2013, restaged by Yuri Grigorovich. And the photo on the left is Anton Savichev dancing the lead fakir, which is the low-status characters which frame the space, especially in the first act. And I just want you to note the rags that he's wearing that expose his skin, which is painted brown. Notice that he looks dirty. Notice the black wig of long, coarse hair that he's wearing. He's just one of many. He's one of many. You can see the 2 men behind him kneeling. They all have this low center of gravity throughout the ballet, and they all look the same. So there's no nuance and diversity or character. They're all just simplified and the same. And then on the right, you have the beautiful Svetlana Zakharova performing Mikia's role. And just noting, and we're going to get a little bit more into this soon, that the costume is not an accurate representation of Indian culture, and also just noticing what makes her a middle class to middle high class character. She has a more ornate costume, and she also has lighter skin, conveniently, right? Post-colonial theorist Edward Said describes the Orient, or any location that was not westernized in the 19th century, as, quote, almost a European invention, and had been since antiquity, a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories and landscapes, and remarkable experiences, unquote. India was a coveted territory for both France and England, often referred to as, quote, the brightest jewel in the imperial crown, unquote. The harnessing of its ancient culture for Europe's consumption was considered the highest emblem of colonial power. Through inaccurate, simplified, and sexualized representation of Indian culture in ballets like La Bayadère, Europe further reinforced its dominance over the East, thus justifying its intent to exploit cultures it perceived as inferior. It was through these research approaches that I became fascinated with the power dynamic involved when one group defines another to intentionally misrepresent them, as well as its implications to erase nuance and diversity. I wanted to explore the various forms of appropriation throughout the ballet and how it continues to widen this gap of differentiation between East and West. As Melanie said in her presentation yesterday, representation matters. So, starting with the term Bayadère itself. This was a particularly challenging aspect of my research. There's not a single ballet or dance history textbook that I came across that correlates the meaning of La Bayadère and connects it to its connection in the ballet that we know it as today. So I thought I would share this with you. This is a drawing of a Devadasi from 1808. Descriptions of the Devadasi first show up in 13th century travel writing. The French would visit India and they would write about the Devadasi. However, instead of calling them by the term Devadasi, an Indian name which actually is representative of who they are, they named them in French Bayadère, which loosely translates to temple dancer in French. So the word Bayadère itself has no connection to India's culture whatsoever. The word shows up again, Bayadère shows up again in Voltaire's work in 1764, and again in Goethe's work in 1797. So even the word Bayadère is an appropriated word. Not even the title of the ballet is culturally accurate. Appropriation in the form of costumes. On the left, you have the same 1808 drawing of the Devadasi, and on the right, you have the 1831 lithograph of Marie Taglioni, a year after her father's opera ballet premiered at the Paris Opera. I also forgot to tell you a fun little side note. I found in a lot of ballet history textbooks that Marie Taglioni's first role is listed as La Sylphide at the Paris Opera in 1832, but this predates that by 2 years. Le Deux et la Bayadère, choreographed by her father. This was actually her first principal role, which she danced for about a decade before she moved on from it. Fun little side note. So if you're comparing the garb, right, we're basically taking the Devadasi clothing and appropriating it onto a romantic tutu for the proscenium stage in Paris. Taglioni's costume, appropriated from Indian culture, is the balleticized iteration of the garb of the Devadasi. The Paris Opera's arbitrary mimicry of the gestures, costumes, and presentational quality of the Devadasi reduced her to an entirely performative, superficial being, instead of the profoundly spiritual vessel that she was within Indian culture. The decontextualization of these centuries-old traditions commodified the Indian woman for public entertainment at the Paris Opera, crafting and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. In light of the British reform of India in the early 19th century, the commodified Devadasi, once an illustration of a sacred culture, comes to symbolize a colonized, exoticized India. The same sort of costume appropriation is happening today. On the left, you have a photo of Malavika Sarakai, a famous Bharatanatyam dancer, and on the right, you have the beautiful Marinella Nunez of the Royal Ballet performing Nikia's role. So just taking a moment to note the performative sexuality, the differences between the two. In Bharatanatyam, sexuality is it's one facet of many of the Bharatanatyam dancers' internal experience, but it's not meant to be this outward performative quality, and just noting the differences in that. Noticing the difference between the two women's gazes, also the amount of skin showing, and differentiating between poses of empowerment versus disempowerment. Within the context of desire, the word commerce expands in meaning. Its definition is not merely the exchange of products or goods, but also encompasses the sexual experience between the white man and the mysterious, sensual woman of color. Post-colonial theorist Robert J.C. Young observes that this commodified relationship, quote, captures the violent, antagonistic power relations of sexual and cultural diffusion, and became the dominant paradigm through which the passionate economic and political trafficking of colonialism was conceived, unquote. If the Orientalized woman of color represented the economic fertility of the East, then to conquer her sexually was to transcend the very limitations of the white realm of knowledge. To explore her body was to commodify and dominate all of her culture. Sexual conquest of the other, or as Bell Hooks phrases it, eating the other, carries and expresses the patriarchal desire to control the Orient, while simultaneously perpetuating the racialized sexual fantasy of the East-West paradigm. Moving on to choreographic and gestural appropriations. So in Bharatanatyam, there are hundreds of mudras, or gestures, with the hands that accompany the eyes, the face, and the rest of the body to all come together in this beautiful package to tell all sorts of narratives. And dancers can train in the form of Bharatanatyam for a lifetime. It's a highly specialized technique, and it has all sorts of cultural implications with it. So the two photos on the outside are of the Czech National Ballet, and the photo in the middle is Joseph Gorak performing Makarova's ABT production, the Golden Idol variation. So I started noticing just the way we're taking these mudras and appropriating them just to make a line or an aesthetic or flavor to bring this style to that we know so well about the Bayadère. On the right, this is a photo of the Dutch National Ballet. Her name is Sasha. She has a 5-syllable last name in Russian. I'm sorry, can't remember it. But just noting, again, the amount of skin showing and the appropriated costume, and also the overt sexuality and desire that she's portraying as a woman, as an Indian woman on stage, in addition to doing this which is a very common gesture throughout the ballet. And then the screenshot on the left is the 1992 production from the Paris Opera. This is Nureev's restaging from 1992, which is the same year he died. But I thought this screenshot was really compelling because Nikia looks, well, she's white, she's small, she's powerless. She's also doing this, another very, very common gesture in the Bayadère, which the middle class and higher characters do when they're in a resting state or a conversational state. I should just do it like this for the rest. But in juxtaposition to the High Brahmin, which is he's so much larger than her. He has brown skin, and his makeup really angularizes his face to make him look evil and inherently bad. Yeah, so that's the gestural appropriations that I studied. Moving on to Blackface and the Bayadère. Let's do it. So this is the most commonly talked about issue of the ballet, and yet it is still happening somehow. On the left, we have a photo from the Bolshoi production. On the right, we have a photo from the Mariinsky production. And just noticing the children, they're children sitting on the floor. They seem to be either painted or wearing black unitards, again with these angularized arms and gestures, both in the Golden Idol variation, as well as the children sitting on the floor. On the upper left, this is a screenshot from the 1992 Nureev version for the Paris Opera. And these children are all painted the same color brown. They're not wearing a ton of clothing. They're all wearing, again, this coarse black wig pulled back into a ponytail. So again, erasing all nuance, erasing all diversity, and obviously they're lower status characters. And on the right, Jeffrey Serio performing Florence Leclerc's restaging for Boston Ballet. And these children are actually dressed in yellowface with little mustaches painted onto their face. And they're not together, which still bugs me. This is not a video, it's a screenshot. This is the best Medici television could do for me since I couldn't go to Russia, my apologies. This is the post-2013 restaging by Yuri Gorovich, and this is what they decided was appropriate for their new production. And in this particular production, the dancers frame the space. They're one of the first or second groups out at the top of the act, and also they are one of the first groups to leave the stage, and they frame the space for 95% of the act. So I then started to look at history of blackface in this production, and I found an 1837 review by Théophile Gautier describing the blackface that was present in Filippo Taglioni's production from 1830. So, in the words of Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, quote, "To stereotype is to simplify," unquote. To simplify is to erase any guilt one may have in exploiting the culture in question. Or to say they are savages further differentiates us, the civilized, justifying the white discourse to overpower the other. This is a photo from the new Ratmansky staging for Berlin. It happened this past winter. And apparently it was just his own restaging, and there was no attempt at addressing any of the appropriations that we've just gone over. So I wanted to know, what is the scope of present-day colonization of India like? What does that look like? So I went down that rabbit hole, and I found that major companies like Facebook, Amazon, Coca-Cola, Walmart, as well as tons of technology and IT companies have all outsourced their labor, factories, and other aspects of their businesses in some way to India. India has less regulations economically, politically, and environmentally, making it easy for Western powers to exploit natural, economic, and intellectual resources. So if it's cheaper, we get a higher profit margin, which always seems to be the bottom line, right? I then researched how Western politics support this discourse of the other, and these are just a few examples of many. Our current leader of the United States building a wall to keep out immigrants or putting them in cages at our southern border. Marine Le Pen's similar stance on immigration for France. Megyn Kelly's 2018 exclamation that we're being too sensitive about the use of blackface as a Halloween costume. Or Virginia Governor Ralph Northam had some blackface photos resurface from his college yearbook, and he is still serving as the governor of Virginia without any repercussion. And lastly, my last example is the controversy of the Confederate statues that's been occurring around this country since 2015. So looking at these oppressive symbols and how polarizing these conversations have been within our country. In the words of dance writer Mariko Nagashima, quote, "Art doesn't exist in a vacuum," unquote. Bayadère's continued popularity represents not only a deficit of knowledge and awareness on these histories of racism, but also a continued presence of the institutionalized racism at play in our societal structures. The racism, sexism, and overall stereotypical vision of Indian people in the ballet expresses not only the vast inequity of representation across the art form, but points to the xenophobic bias that continues to inform white culture as a whole. The exoticized, sexualized characterizations of both men and women portrayed in La Bayadère are harmful and exclusionary to minorities, as they perpetuate white culture's covert discourse of the colonizer-colonized relationship. The core of the issue is purposeful misrepresentation and exclusion. Given the abundance of literature available on the exploitation of India by the West, it is especially problematic that these histories are continuously decontextualized from the ballet itself. So last July, I flew to LA and I went and saw, it had been a while since I'd seen ABT's Bayadère, so I made a special trip to LA to go see that. And at intermission, I was really disgusted because we're having all these conversations about race and inclusion and awareness and sensitivity, And yet, at intermission, not a single person talked about the skin of the core dancers and the lower status characters were painted. They were all talking about the virtuosity of the dancers, which I found to be a little bit questionable, but that's a side note. Sorry. Yeah, so I just found it disappointing that we're not actually talking about the issue. We claim to be, but I mean, in that context, no one seemed upset about it at that particular night of the show, and I was disappointed about that. So, if ballet is a mirror of white culture and its collective narrative of the other, then La Bayadère continues to reflect the foundation of Orientalism and colonialism that inform and shape our society today. As symbols and actions of white supremacy are called into question, I argue that La Bayadère itself is a living, breathing symbol of these oppressive structures that support such differentiation, and it too must be examined critically. So, these various forms of misrepresentation and simplification have come from so many different angles, from the title of the ballet, the costumes, movement vocabulary, sexualization of women, blackface, and for another paper in another universe, sets and pentatonic music structures are also appropriated. So the question is, of many questions, which I have for you, is how do we address these issues in the ballet while still honoring its history? Is that even possible, and how do we proceed? Does Bayadère exist without all the things I just went over? The classicist argument for keeping La Bayadère in our rep is that it's a huge stepping stone for any ballet company in its artistic and technical challenges that it offers the dancers. Others have offered a few ideas. Remove blackface. Absolutely, we should definitely remove blackface. However, that's clearly just one facet of the misrepresentation and appropriation that's happening in this production. Another idea is to only perform shades. Okay, well, that not only decontextualizes the entire storyline of the ballet, but it still has misrepresentation in it, in the form of opium, right? Because Solor smokes the opium and has the dream. And this represents the devastating socioeconomic impact of the opium trade among Britain, India, and China. Another idea, which I disagree with, is to stop performing it altogether. But the ballet's history is far-reaching, and to erase it is to lose an important aspect of ballet history. And it's also a lost opportunity to understand the interconnectedness of ballet to world events and colonial aspirations. There's an Indian woman and contemporary choreographer named Shabana Jayasingh, and she has actually re-choreographed a Bayadère with a new plot line, which is to change the gaze and empower the Indian experience, as well as to acknowledge and educate. It's called the Bayadère, The Ninth Life. I have not seen it. I couldn't find a video of it, but I like that idea. Similarly, Tamara Rojo of the English National Ballet in 2017 commissioned Akram Khan to create a brand new Giselle. And that's great, but the greatest part to me is that not only did she commission this new ballet, but she also juxtaposed it with the original 1841 restaging within the season. So the dancers were rehearsing both productions at the same time. So they would, and everyone in this process started having conversations about what is relevant to the art form, what does this mean, what did this mean, where are we going as artists and as a ballet company, and how do we deal with representation and empowering people. So I thought, there's a beautiful interview of her on YouTube talking about that. I recommend that you watch it if you're interested. Also, the traditional approach of teaching the dance canon is outdated. Kate Mattingly taught me that. Thanks, Kate, wherever you are. I can't see very well. Oh, there you are. Yeah, so I mean, I've spent a lot of my life studying dates and all the very, very basic things that you need to know as a dancer. However, it's been taught as its own island of information, completely decontextualized from world events. So it should not be an island, in my opinion. I think dance history is an excellent way to gauge or mark colonial and racist histories as a way to think critically about our art form and think critically about our world historical events as well. So why this matters to me the most. I know that this is a really complicated problem and there's no smooth edge here, but this is really optimistic of me, but I think ballet can be an excellent platform for humanity, to find joy, self-expression, community, among thousands of other reasons why we all are in this art form. But this unacknowledged history of our racism in this art form, I think, is holding us back. And I teach a lot of kids ages 8 to 25, and I'm seeing the trickle-down effect in the studio. Ever since I started getting my MFA, I have been noticing the way that children of color in my classes can often feel underrepresented, if represented at all, and how disempowering that can be for them. And I've actually become more sensitive to that. And I think it's a really vital responsibility that we have as dance educators, which I know I'm preaching to you guys with all more experience than me, so my apologies. But that trickle-down effect kind of breaks my heart, that kids are still feeling disempowered from an art form that has brought me personally so much joy and community and happiness. So, with that, last slide. Unfortunately, the iconic ballet, Bayadère, does not exist without colonial fantasy and aggression. Instead of ceasing performances of the ballet altogether, which would discard a significant facet of ballet's ephemeral historical canon, Bayadère could be utilized as a living historical document, or a reflective resource by which to educate artistic directors, dancers, and patrons of the arts about India's complex relationships with the colonial West. This multidisciplinary approach would preserve the ballet, recontextualize Indian culture with the respect that it deserves, and finally, expand the art form of ballet into a more versatile conversational platform for cultural awareness and inclusion. Thoughtful analysis and acknowledgement of these deeply exclusionary racist residues are the key to ballet's continued diversification, evolution, and overall relevance in a post-colonial world. Thank you. So I know it's messy, and I don't have all the answers, and I'm just curious what you guys think about this, and what you guys do you have ideas for solutions, the way that we can address this while also honoring the ballet's history? How do we proceed? Is my question for you guys.
I can just say too, this is something that I've been, thinking about for a long time, and recently, ABT just had this big women's movement and everything, and they commissioned a woman choreographer to dance to choreographic full-length work, Bayadère. And I loved it. I thought it was really, it was just an amazing ballet. And then the next week,
education has been slow to embrace the student experience and knowledge in ways that not only can we support their education and contextualizing of these experiences, but I think our students' generation is also poised to think of additional ways in which this can be generationally transmitted and transformed. I mean, I think, it's, yes, we as educators have an extreme responsibility. I was thinking, this would be such a wonderful presentation for Dance USA, for every artistic director that is thinking about staging Bayadère, and the dancers who are dancing it so often as a company dancer, there isn't perhaps time or the opportunity to really understand the context of what you're dancing and performing, and the step back and the step outside of. But I also think that our students can really and would be just empowered like crazy to dive into their own ways of living with and carrying forward this information in ways that we might not even be able to imagine, but they can too. So the student voice in that, figuring out how to move forward process, I think could be another key.
Can I respond to you? Is that okay? Yeah, so I presented this was my thesis at the University of Utah this past May. And the students who listened to this were so incensed by this whole conversation, and my thesis defense went over by like half an hour because they were going back and forth, and I just sat there just watching them go back and forth, and it was really exciting because that's the point, right? Is to create conversation about it, around it. So it's exciting to see the enthusiasm for change from the upcoming generation. I don't know who to call on. You had a hand up that you saw first, I don't know. There was a person.
I'll let you pick. I saw Angela's hand first, but go ahead. You can pick.
That's a lot of pressure.
We have about 5 minutes, so.
Angela, do you want to?
Well, I was just thinking about backing off of Elizabeth. How exciting that could be to, as a dancer, have this background, and then be able to make different artistic choices in terms of how you are going to make movement. And so you are then informed in a way that allows you to make choices. And I think that is just, I get chills just thinking about that opportunity as an artist, and I just think it's the importance of really being able to give the history of the work. So all involved can approach it from their varying perspectives.
I'm just so curious when we talk about reimagining classical ballet without losing its inherent, qualities. If there's a way to strip or replace the cultural identities that are being portrayed. So if it wasn't written in India, what if it was India and India?
How would that work?
How would, or, just how would we do that in a way that's respectful, but perhaps with program notes and a comparison of how we're looking at this, so that we're keeping the choreography and the movement for the most part inherently, perhaps removing some of the appropriations of mudras or other things, or bringing in a Bharatanatyam specialist and then trying to infuse it with more appropriate and culturally accurate movements or mudras or costuming. Is there a way to take the choreography that's inherently what we cherish and find another, to either remove some of the cultural identity or to enhance it and to change it in a way that's not plotting two different identities against one another, a Western power, dominating, or to reverse it, to make the dominant power the Indian. I don't know. That's
Yeah.
reverse racism, but
Yeah, I just wondered. I'm really curious about Shabana Jayasingh's work. I understand it's contemporary, but I think it needs to be a person who is Indian to choreograph it, and who also has ballet information. And I don't even know what that would look like. I think it needs to be done. Yes.
I have two thoughts. The ballet like this always brings to mind that in so many cultures women have never had power.
Yeah.
And yet a ballet company relies on women doing very powerful work to be achieved, and yet within a ballet company, where's the power structure? And two, that it is such a good lesson for those of us who bring in residents, or guest artists for a resident of a week, and then all of a sudden our students are choreographing that material, appropriating what they've done as if they're experts.
Right.
They have studied
Yeah.
for a semester, and the next thing we know, they are appropriating that as if they are experts. And we have done this with our best hearts. We
Yes.
thought this would be good for them. And look what we've done. We've done it again. And how do we translate that so they understand the training and the study and the appropriation of that and the handling of that? Does that conversation also go along with residency? A carefulness of what you're doing? And just thoughts.
I think there's a special place in our education realm for us to look at curricula for different courses as they're being taught. So for example, if we're doing the Bayadère in fall of 2020, can we also in our dance history or critical studies theory courses, can we also have conversations contextualizing that? And I think that's one of the main things that I love about academia is that there's an opportunity for this cohesion across coursework, which Kate Mattingly, again, does really beautifully. Yeah. 1 minute, okay.
Thank you for that, Colleen. That was great.
Thank you.
I just want to throw out there that we tend to think of ballets like this, the canonical ballets that are whatever problems they have. This is not original work as we see it today performed by ballet companies. This has been shaped and reshaped, and Petipa reshaped it, as you clearly stated that it came from earlier. Petipa was notorious for taking works from the Romantic era and completely redoing them. I mean, it happened with Giselle. The Giselle we see today is not the Giselle from 1830. We know that, and we've seen that evolution, and we've seen the way that both for reasons of dancer prowess, dancers have different emphases in different areas of their work that they can emphasize or re-emphasize or de-emphasize, depending on, what they want to do. And the divas make them re-choreograph. That's why we have 40 versions of every variation. And I think,
For which I'm thankful.
well, absolutely. 100%.
Last time.
I think my students are going to know about that too. When I teach variations classes, I offer versions.
Yeah, me too.
Because that's historically accurate to do that, to shape the work. And I think what you're saying is now the sort of, it is an encouraging moment for us to say, let's embrace that history of being able to adapt as needed for the time that we're in and the people who are on stage. And the nation that we're in. I mean, I think that's sort of another little element to this, a little layer here. Like,
Yes.
What nation is staging this work, and what are those audiences looking for or at? But I think the notion of being able to adapt it, we're not hurting it. It's fine. It's robust. It will live.
I appreciate that.
We can shove things around a little.
Time, it's so exciting. Keep it going. In a 5-minute break.